My name is Zakaria. I was 28 years old on February 14th, 2019, when I committed what should have been the perfect crime against Christianity. I set a church on fire, but God had other plans. Let me tell you how Jesus Christ saved my soul through the very flames I lit to destroy him. I was born into a world where hatred was handed down like a family heirloom. As the third son of a prominent Saudi royal family, I inherited more than just wealth and status. I inherited a legacy of religious fervor that burned hotter than the desert sun. My father ruled our household with the same iron fist that our ancestors used to conquer lands in the name of Allah. Every morning before dawn, he would gather us for prayer, his voice echoing through the marble halls of our palace as he recited verses from the Quran with the passion of a man who believed every word could save or damn a soul. From the moment I could walk, I was taught that Christians were the enemies of Islam. My tutors, handpicked scholars from the most conservative madrasas, filled my young mind with stories of the Crusades, painting every Christian as a bloodthirsty invader seeking to destroy our holy faith. They spoke of Western imperialism as if it were happening in our very streets, as if every missionary who dared set foot in our land was personally responsible for centuries of warfare. My father would sit me on his knee and tell me tales of how Christians had tried to steal the Holy Land from Muslims, how they had murdered innocent believers in the name of their false trinity. His eyes would blaze with righteous anger as he described the corruption of Christianity, how they worshipped a man instead of the one true God. I absorbed every word like a sponge soaks up water. By the age of 10, I could recite lengthy passages about the errors of Christian doctrine. I knew every argument against the divinity of Christ, every reason why the Bible was corrupted, every proof that Islam was the final and perfect revelation. My brothers and I would compete to see who could deliver the most convincing arguments against Christianity during our evening discussions with Father. It became a twisted form of entertainment, this intellectual warfare against a faith I had never truly encountered. The walls of our palace were lined with books that spoke of Christian deception and Western plots to undermine Islam. I spent countless hours reading accounts of how Christian missionaries were secretly working to convert Muslim youth, how they used charity and education as weapons to steal souls from the true path. These stories filled me with a burning sense of duty to protect my faith and my people from this insidious threat. I began to see Christians not as individual human beings, but as soldiers in an army bent on destroying everything I held sacred. When I turned 18, Father sent me to study at a prestigious Islamic university. There, my anti Christian education intensified under professors who had dedicated their lives to defending Islam against what they called the Christian assault on truth. They taught me that tolerance was weakness, that interfaith dialogue was a trap designed to make Muslims compromise their beliefs. I learned to debate with Christians not to understand them, but to defeat them utterly and completely. Every class, every discussion, every assignment reinforced the same message. Christianity was not just wrong, it was evil. During my university years, I witnessed something that would fuel my hatred for years to come. I discovered that my younger sister had been secretly listening to Christian music she had found online. When Father learned of this, the rage that consumed our household was unlike anything I had ever seen. He locked her in her room for weeks, brought in religious counselors to cleanse her mind of what he called Christian poison, and made the entire family fast and pray for her soul. The shame that fell upon our family was unbearable. Relatives whispered about our failure, to properly guard our children against Western influence, father's reputation in our community suffered, and I watched as the man I respected above all others appeared to age years in a matter of days. It was during sister's punishment that I made a private vow. I swore to Allah that I would never allow Christianity to touch my family again. I would become a warrior for the faith, a guardian of Islamic purity. I began spending my free time researching Christian communities in our area, learning about their activities, their meeting places, their methods of spreading what I believed was spiritual corruption. I told myself that knowledge of the enemy was essential for victory. The more I learned about local Christians, the more my hatred grew. I discovered that they were holding secret prayer meetings, that they were translating Christian materials into Arabic, that some were even attempting to share their faith with Muslims. Each revelation felt like a personal attack on everything I held dear. How dare they try to steal souls that belong to Allah? How dare they pollute our holy land with their false teaching? Have you ever felt so sure of your beliefs that you were willing to hurt others to defend them? That was where I found myself at the age of 28. My hatred had grown from childhood conditioning into an all-consuming fire that demanded action. I could no longer be content with simply believing that Christians were wrong. I needed to do something about it. I needed to send a message that would protect other Muslim families from experiencing the shame and anguish that had befallen mine. I began planning acts of religious vandalism, small at first, but growing bolder as my sense of righteous duty intensified. I would deface Christian symbols I found in public spaces, scatter garbage around Christian bookstores, make threatening phone calls to Christian organizations, but none of these actions satisfied the burning need for justice that consumed my heart. I needed to do something that would really matter, something that would strike fear into the hearts of those who dared challenge Islam in my homeland. That is when I decided that burning a church would be my gift to Allah. It would be a statement that could not be ignored, a warning that Muslims would not passively allow their faith to be undermined. I convinced myself that this act of destruction would be an act of worship, a demonstration of my love for God and my commitment to protecting His truth from those who would corrupt it. The church I selected stood like a quiet sentinel on the outskirts of our city, far from the bustling commercial districts where my family conducted business. It was a modest building, perhaps 50 years old, with weathered stone walls and a simple wooden cross mounted above the entrance. I had driven past it dozens of times during my surveillance, noting the patterns of the small congregation, studying their schedules, memorizing every detail of the property. The church held services 3 times per week, but I knew that Tuesday evenings it would be completely empty. The pastor lived several miles away, and the building would be dark and abandoned until the following Sunday morning. I chose this particular church not because it was the largest or most prominently Christian building in our area, but because it was vulnerable. The security was minimal, consisting of nothing more than basic locks on the doors and windows. There were no cameras, no alarm systems, no guards to complicate my mission. More importantly, it was isolated enough that the fire would burn for precious minutes before anyone noticed the flames. This would give me time to escape and ensure that the destruction would be complete before the fire department could respond. For weeks, I meticulously planned every detail of what I convinced myself would be a righteous act of religious warfare. I purchased gasoline in small quantities from different stations across the city, storing the fuel in metal containers in an abandoned warehouse my family owned. I acquired matches, rags, and other supplies I would need to ensure the fire spread quickly and thoroughly. I studied the church layout through windows, noting the wooden pews, the fabric banners, the carpeted aisles that would provide perfect fuel for the flames I planned to unleash. The symbolic significance of Valentine's Day was not lost on me. While Western culture celebrated love on February 14th, I would demonstrate the love I bore for Islam by destroying a temple dedicated to what I believed was false worship. The irony felt poetic in my twisted mindset. As others exchanged gifts of affection, I would offer the ultimate gift of devotion to Allah by purging our community of Christian influence. On the evening of February 14th, 2019, I loaded my car with the supplies I had carefully gathered over the preceding weeks. The gasoline containers filled my trunk with their acrid odor, a smell that should have warned me of the destruction I was about to unleash upon myself. I drove through the darkened streets with steady hands and a heart that felt cold and focused. There was no nervousness, no second guessing, no doubt about the righteousness of my mission. I had convinced myself so thoroughly that this act was pleasing to God that I felt a sense of peace as I approached the target. The church parking lot was empty as I had expected. I parked my car at the edge of the property, positioning it for a quick escape once my work was complete. The February night was crisp but not uncomfortably cold, and the stars above seemed to shine with unusual brightness. I remember thinking that even the heavens were illuminating my path as I gathered my supplies and approached the building that I intended to reduce to ashes. Breaking into the church proved easier than I had anticipated. A basement window yielded to gentle pressure, allowing me to slip inside without triggering any alarms or attracting attention from passing vehicles. The darkness inside was complete, forcing me to use a small flashlight to navigate through the basement and up into the main sanctuary. My footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floors as I emerged into the worship space that would soon become an inferno. For one moment, as my flashlight beam swept across the interior of the church, I experienced something unexpected. The sanctuary was beautiful in a way I had not anticipated. Stained glass windows caught fragments of streetlight from outside, casting subtle colors across wooden pews that showed the wear of decades of faithful worshippers. At the front of the church, a simple wooden altar held an open Bible, its pages reflecting the light from my flashlight. To the left stood a statue of Mary, her face serene and compassionate, hands extended as if in welcome. Above the altar, a wooden crucifix displayed the figure of Jesus, arms outstretched in an eternal gesture that I interpreted at the time as defeat. For one second, I almost stopped. There was something about the peacefulness of that space, the sense of reverence that seemed to permeate even the silence, that gave me pause. But I quickly pushed aside these feelings, reminding myself that this was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that made Christianity so dangerous. The beauty was a trap designed to seduce the unwary into abandoning the truth of Islam. I steeled my heart against any sympathy for the building or its purpose. I began my work methodically, pouring gasoline throughout the sanctuary with the precision of a man performing a sacred ritual. The pews received generous portions of fuel, as did the carpeted aisles and the wooden paneling that lined the walls. I saved the area around the altar for last, drenching the Bible, the statue, and the crucifix with extra gasoline to ensure they would be consumed completely. These symbols of false worship deserved special attention in my campaign of righteous destruction. The smell of gasoline filled the church as I completed my preparations. I stood in the center aisle, matches in hand, surveying the scene of what would soon be a magnificent fire. My heart filled with religious fervor as I prepared to light the first match. This was my moment of triumph, my gift to Allah, my declaration of war against those who would corrupt the pure faith of Islam. I struck the match and watched as the small flame danced in the darkness. For a brief moment, that tiny light seemed to illuminate the entire sanctuary, casting dancing shadows on the walls and ceiling. I felt righteous as I knelt down and touched the flame to a gasoline-soaked rag I had placed near the front pew. The fire caught immediately, racing along the trail of fuel I had so carefully laid throughout the building. The flames spread faster than I had anticipated. Within seconds, multiple fires were burning throughout the sanctuary, filling the air with heat and smoke that began to make breathing difficult. I watched with satisfaction as my plan unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. The wooden pews caught fire quickly, sending bright orange flames toward the ceiling. The fabric elements in the church began to burn with impressive intensity, creating a roaring sound that filled me with a sense of accomplished mission. But as the smoke thickened and the heat became overwhelming, I realized that I had underestimated the speed and intensity of the fire I had created. The flames were spreading more rapidly than I had planned, and the smoke was making it difficult to see the exit I had planned to use for my escape. What had seemed like a controlled act of destruction was quickly becoming a dangerous situation that threatened my own safety. What would you do when everything you planned starts spiraling beyond your control? That was the question I faced as I turned toward what I thought was the basement door, desperate to escape the inferno I had created. The heat was becoming unbearable. The smoke was burning my lungs, and the roar of the flames was drowning out my ability to think clearly. But as I turned to run, I saw something that made me freeze in absolute terror. The flames were consuming everything in their path exactly as I had planned. But what I witnessed in that moment defied every law of nature I had ever learned. The fire was raging with incredible intensity throughout the sanctuary, devouring the wooden pews, climbing the walls, reaching toward the ceiling with hungry orange tongues. The heat was so intense that I could feel it burning my face, even from several feet away. The smoke was so thick that breathing had become painful and difficult. But there, in the center of this inferno I had created, three objects remained completely untouched by the destruction surrounding them. The open Bible on the altar sat pristine and peaceful, its pages as white and clean as if they had just been printed. Not a single page was curled by heat, not a single word was obscured by smoke or soot. The book lay open to a passage I could clearly read despite the chaos around it, the text perfectly legible, while everything else in the church was being consumed by flames. Around the Bible, the wooden altar was burning fiercely, the wood crackling and splitting from the intense heat. Yet the sacred book remained as untouched as if it were protected by an invisible shield. To the left of the altar, the statue of Mary stood with the same serene expression she had worn when I first entered the church. Her white robes showed no trace of smoke damage. Her face bore no marks of soot or heat. The flames were reaching toward her from every direction, licking at the wooden platform beneath her feet, yet she remained perfectly clean and undamaged. I could see the fire dancing around her figure, but it was as if the flames simply could not touch her. Even more incredible, the small flowers that had been placed at the base of her statue were still fresh and colorful. completely unaffected by the inferno that should have incinerated them instantly. Above the altar, the wooden crucifix of Jesus presented the most impossible sight of all. The cross itself should have been among the first casualties of the fire, being made of wood and positioned directly in the path of the flames I had set. Instead, it stood firm and unmarked, the figure of Jesus clearly visible, despite the smoke and heat that surrounded it. The wood showed no signs of burning, no blackening from smoke, no warping from the extreme temperatures that were destroying everything else in the building. It was as if the crucifix existed in a different reality, one where fire had no power to destroy. My mind immediately began trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I told myself that these objects must have been treated with some kind of fire-resistant chemical, that the church leaders had somehow anticipated an attack and taken precautions to protect their most sacred items. I looked for logical explanations, searching for evidence of protective barriers or fire suppression systems that might explain the impossible scene before me. But the more I examined the situation, the more I realized that no human explanation could account for what I was witnessing. I forced myself to move closer to the altar, fighting against the heat and smoke that made every breath painful. The temperature near the untouched objects should have been unbearable, yet as I approached the Bible, I felt a strange coolness in the air around it. I reached out with trembling hands and actually touched the book, expecting to find some kind of protective coating or barrier. Instead, my fingers met pages that were not only undamaged but actually cool to the touch, as if they had been resting in an air-conditioned room rather than the center of a raging fire. I moved to the statue of Mary and found the same impossible phenomenon. Despite being surrounded by flames hot enough to melt metal, the statue was cool and clean. I ran my hands over the white robes, expecting to find heat or soot, but instead encountered a surface that felt as if it had just been carefully cleaned and polished. The flowers at her feet were not only undamaged but seemed to be thriving, their colors more vibrant than they should have been even under normal circumstances. The wooden crucifix proved equally impossible to explain through natural means. I touched the wood and found it cool and smooth, showing no signs of the extreme heat that was destroying identical wood throughout the rest of the building. The figure of Jesus was perfectly preserved, every detail of the carving as clear and sharp as if it had just been completed by a master craftsman. There was no logical, scientific explanation for what I was experiencing. As I stood there among these three miraculous survivals, the full weight of the impossible began to crush down upon my understanding of reality. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world was being challenged by what I was witnessing. The fire I had set was behaving according to normal physical laws everywhere except around these three Christian symbols. The heat, the flames, the smoke were all exactly as intense and destructive as they should be, consuming wood, fabric, and metals with expected efficiency. But these three objects existed in a space where different rules applied, where fire had no power to destroy. My knees began to shake as the implications of what I was seeing started to penetrate my mind. If these objects were being supernaturally protected, then everything I had been taught about Christianity being a false religion was being challenged by evidence I could not deny. If God was real and was protecting these symbols of Christian faith, then my entire worldview was built on a foundation of lies. How would you react if everything you believed about God was challenged in one moment? That was the question I faced as I stood in that burning church, surrounded by impossible miracles that defied every assumption I had made about the nature of reality. The heat from the fire was making it difficult to think clearly, but the coolness around the protected objects was creating a strange sanctuary within the inferno I had created. But even as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing, I began to sense that I was not alone in that burning church. There was a presence in that space that was far more powerful than the fire, far more real than the smoke and heat that surrounded me. Someone was watching me, and that someone had the power to protect these sacred objects from the destruction I had unleashed. The realization filled me with a terror that was deeper than any fear I had ever experienced, because I knew that this presence had every right to be angry with me for what I had done. Yet what I felt was not anger or judgment, but something far more disturbing to my understanding of justice. What I felt was love. The love I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 28 years of life. It was not the conditional love of family that depended on my behavior or achievements. It was not the transactional love of friendships that required mutual benefit. This was something pure and overwhelming, a love that seemed to see directly into my soul and accept everything it found there, even the hatred and violence that had brought me to this place. The presence I sensed in that burning church loved me completely, knowing exactly what I had done and why I had done it. I had expected divine wrath. I had prepared myself for the judgment of an angry God who would strike me down for my crimes against his people and his house of worship. Instead, I found myself enveloped in a love so profound that it began to melt the hatred I had carried in my heart since childhood. The voice that spoke to me was not audible in the way human voices are heard, but it communicated more clearly than any words ever could. The message was simple and devastating to everything I thought I knew about God. Zachariah, I have been waiting for you. Those words shattered my understanding of reality more completely than witnessing the miraculous protection of the Bible, statue, and a crucifix. God had not been surprised by my attack on his church. He had not been caught off guard by my hatred or my violence. Instead, he had been waiting for me, anticipating this moment when I would finally encounter him face to face in the ruins of my own destructive plans. The implications of this divine patience were staggering to contemplate. How could God have been waiting for someone who had spent years plotting against his followers? How could divine love extend to someone who had just attempted to destroy a sacred space dedicated to worship? Everything I had been taught about God's justice demanded punishment for what I had done. Yet here I was, standing in the midst of supernatural protection, hearing words of welcome rather than condemnation. My internal dialogue became a battlefield between everything I had believed and everything I was experiencing. The Islamic teachings of my childhood insisted that Allah would never speak to someone who was attacking his true religion. But if Islam was the complete truth I had always believed it to be, then why was the God of the Christians demonstrating such obvious power and protection? Why were Christian symbols surviving an inferno while I, a Muslim who claimed to serve the true God, was being shown mercy by the very deity I had tried to dishonor? I fell to my knees among the flames that somehow were not burning me, surrounded by smoke that somehow was not choking me, in the presence of a God who somehow was not destroying me for my crimes. The wooden floor beneath me should have been blazing with heat, but instead, I felt only a strange coolness that defied every law of physics. The air around me should have been unbreathable, but instead, I was breathing more easily than I had in years. Jesus, forgive me for what I have done. The words came from somewhere deeper than my conscious mind, rising from a place in my soul that I had not even known existed. I had never prayed to Jesus before in my life. I had been taught that such prayers were blasphemy, that acknowledging Jesus as anything more than a human prophet was the gravest sin a person could commit. Yet in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Jesus was exactly who his followers claimed he was. The evidence was surrounding me, protecting me, loving me, despite my attempts to destroy him. As I knelt there in that miraculous space, my entire worldview began to collapse and rebuild itself around the truth I was experiencing. Every argument against Christianity that I had memorized crumbled in the face of supernatural love and power. Every reason I had been given for hating Christians evaporated in the warmth of divine acceptance. I was being transformed at the deepest level of my being, changed from a man consumed by religious hatred into someone desperate for the forgiveness of the God he had tried to attack. The physical miracles I was witnessing were nothing compared to the spiritual miracle taking place inside my heart. The hatred that had defined my identity for decades was being dissolved by a love more powerful than anything I had imagined possible. The pride that had driven me to commit this act of violence was being replaced by humility that brought me to my knees. The certainty I had felt about my religious superiority was being transformed into recognition that I had been completely wrong about the most important questions in life. I surrendered my life to the God I came to destroy. The irony was not lost on me, even in that moment of transformation. I had entered this church as a warrior for Islam, convinced that I was serving the true God by attacking false religion. I was living as a follower of Jesus Christ, having encountered the living God in the very place I had tried to destroy in his name. The complete reversal of my spiritual condition was as miraculous as anything else that happened that night. Have you ever experienced a moment when God completely rewrote your understanding of who he is? That was what I experienced as I knelt in that burning church, feeling divine love replace the hatred that had poisoned my heart for so many years. Nothing in my Islamic education had prepared me for encountering a God who responded to attack with love, who protected his symbols while extending mercy to their attacker, who called someone by name in their moment of greatest rebellion against him. The fire around me continued to rage, consuming everything in the church except the 3 protected objects and the small area where I knelt. But I was no longer afraid of the flames. I had found something worth more than my physical safety, more valuable than my life itself. I had found the truth that my soul had been searching for without even knowing it. I had found Jesus Christ, and he had found me in the darkness of my own making. As the sound of fire trucks began to echo in the distance, I knew that I had to leave this place. But I was not the same person who had entered this church with gasoline and matches. I was a new creation, born again in the midst of the fire I had set to destroy the very faith that had just saved my soul. I had come as Zachariah the destroyer, but I was leaving as Zachariah the redeemed. The physical exit from the church was as miraculous as everything else that had happened that night. Despite the raging fire throughout the building, a clear path opened before me, leading me safely to the basement window through which I had entered. I walked out a completely different man than the one who had walked in. carrying with me the knowledge that the God of the Christians was real, powerful, and infinitely more loving than I had ever dared to imagine. The drive home from the church felt like traveling between two different worlds. In the rear view mirror, I could see the orange glow of flames consuming the building I had set ablaze, while ahead of me lay the familiar streets of a life that suddenly felt foreign and distant. My hands gripped the steering wheel with trembling fingers as my mind struggled to process what had just occurred. Everything I thought I knew about God, about truth, about my own identity had been shattered and reconstructed in the span of 30 minutes. I arrived at our family palace in the early hours of morning, parking my car in the same spot I had used thousands of times before. But walking through the front doors felt like entering a museum dedicated to a person I used to be. The marble halls that had once represented the height of Islamic achievement now seemed hollow and meaningless. The prayer rugs that had been the foundation of my daily spiritual practice now felt like props in a performance I could no longer maintain with any conviction. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling as dawn broke over the Saudi landscape, my mind replaying every moment of the supernatural encounter I had experienced. The smell of gasoline still clung to my clothes, serving as a constant reminder that the miraculous events of the night were not some elaborate dream. I had indeed set a church on fire, and I had indeed witnessed the power of the Christian God protecting his sacred symbols while extending mercy to his attacker. Over the following days, I found myself unable to eat normally or maintain the routines that had structured my life for decades. The morning prayers that had been automatic since childhood now felt like empty rituals directed toward a God who had remained silent, while the God of the Christians had spoken directly to my heart. I went through the motions of Islamic worship, but my soul was no longer present in the familiar words and gestures that had once provided comfort and meaning. I knew I needed to learn more about the faith that had so dramatically captured my attention. Using extreme caution to avoid detection by family members or household staff, I began researching Christianity through internet sources and carefully selected books. Every page I read confirmed what I had experienced in that burning church. The Jesus described in Christian scripture was exactly the loving, powerful, forgiving God I had encountered among the flames. The gospel accounts of Jesus healing the sick, forgiving his enemies, and loving those who persecuted him resonated with the divine mercy I had personally received. The stories of his death and resurrection took on profound personal meaning as I began to understand that the sacrifice described in these ancient texts was made specifically for people like me, people who had spent their lives as enemies of God, but who could be transformed by his grace. Learning to pray as a Christian felt awkward and uncertain at first. I had spent decades following the precise rituals and recitations of Islamic prayer, but Christian prayer seemed to invite a personal conversation with God that was both intimate and free form. I would whisper tentative words to Jesus in the privacy of my room, asking for guidance and forgiveness, marveling at the sense of his presence that accompanied even my clumsy attempts at communication. Every page of Christian material I secretly read confirmed what I experienced that night. The descriptions of God's character matched perfectly with the love and mercy I had encountered. The promises of forgiveness for even the worst sinners gave hope to someone who had committed what seemed like an unforgivable act of religious violence. The invitation to a personal relationship with God spoke to a longing in my heart that decades of Islamic practice had never satisfied. But living this double life was becoming increasingly difficult as the transformation in my heart began to manifest in changes that others could observe. My family members began to notice that I was less enthusiastic about our traditional religious discussions, that I seemed distracted during prayers, that my usual passion for defending Islam against Christian influence had mysteriously disappeared. My father, always alert to any sign of spiritual weakness in his sons, began asking pointed questions about my recent behavior and attitudes. I was caught between two worlds, unable to fully embrace my new faith openly while finding it impossible to maintain the pretense of my old beliefs with any authenticity. The weight of this deception was crushing, but the fear of discovery was even more terrifying. I knew that revealing my conversion to Christianity would result in consequences far more severe than simple family disappointment. In our culture, abandoning Islam for Christianity was considered not just spiritual betrayal, but an act of treason against our entire way of life. The turning point came when I realized I needed to connect with other Christians who could help me understand and practice my new faith. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, I discovered that there was a small underground network of Christian believers in our region, including several former Muslims who had converted to Christianity, despite the enormous personal risks involved. Making contact with these believers required extreme caution, but I knew that I could not continue growing in my faith while remaining completely isolated. My first meeting with Pastor Ahmad, a former Islamic scholar who had converted to Christianity years earlier, took place in a remote location far from any area where I might be recognized. This man, who had sacrificed his reputation and security to follow Jesus, became my first teacher in the Christian faith. He helped me understand the Bible, explained the significance of baptism, and prepared me for the challenges that lay ahead as a secret believer in a hostile environment. Through Pastor Ahmad, I learned that my experience was not unique. He introduced me to several other former Muslims who had come to faith in Christ through various supernatural encounters and divine interventions. Their stories gave me courage and helped me realize that God was actively working to call people out of Islam and into relationship with Jesus Christ, despite the obvious dangers and difficulties such conversions created. The decision to be baptized felt like crossing a point of no return. Pastor Ahmad explained that this step would represent my public declaration of faith in Jesus Christ, my identification with his death and resurrection, and my commitment to following him regardless of the cost. We planned the ceremony for a remote location where the risk of discovery would be minimal, but I knew that taking this step would make my conversion complete and irreversible. As I prepared for baptism, my family's suspicions about my changed behavior continued to intensify. Father had begun making comments about my lack of enthusiasm for Islamic discussions, and I could sense that he was beginning to piece together evidence that something significant had changed in my spiritual condition. The tension in our household was becoming unbearable, and I knew that a confrontation was inevitable. What would you be willing to give up to follow Jesus? And that question haunted me as I stood on the brink of a decision that would cost me everything I had known and valued in my previous life: the wealth, the status, the family relationships, the cultural identity that had defined my existence for 28 years would all be at risk if I continued down the path that had begun in that burning church. But I had found something worth more than all the riches in Saudi Arabia. The peace, joy, and purpose that had entered my life through my relationship with Jesus Christ were treasures that no earthly possession could match. The love of God that I experienced daily in prayer and Bible study was more valuable than any inheritance or social position. I had discovered the truth that my soul had been searching for without even knowing it, and no price was too high to pay to keep it. The night of my baptism arrived on a warm evening in late spring. As Pastor Ahmad lowered me into the waters and raised me up again in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I felt the final chains of my old life breaking away. I emerged from that water as a fully committed follower of Jesus Christ, ready to face whatever consequences my faith would bring. Standing firm in my decision meant that the confrontation with my family could no longer be postponed. The confrontation I had been dreading finally came on a Thursday morning in June, 3 months after my encounter with Jesus in that burning church. Father discovered a small Bible I had been hiding in my room, along with handwritten notes from my secret meetings with Pastor Ahmad. The rage that consumed him was unlike anything I had witnessed, even during the crisis with my sister's Christian music. He summoned the entire extended family for an emergency meeting, declaring that a spiritual cancer had infected our household and needed to be cut out immediately. I was ordered to stand before an assembly of uncles, cousins, and religious advisors, while Father held up the evidence of my betrayal like a prosecutor presenting damning testimony in court. The Bible seemed to burn in his hands as he demanded explanations for what he called my descent into apostasy and spiritual treason. The shame and disappointment in his eyes was more painful than any physical punishment could have been. This man, who had raised me to be a defender of Islam, was now forced to confront the reality that his own son had become what he considered the enemy. The ultimatum was delivered with the cold precision of a business transaction. I would renounce Christianity publicly, undergo intensive Islamic re-education with the most conservative scholars available, and dedicate the rest of my life to making amends for my betrayal of the faith. Alternatively, I would be permanently disowned from the family, stripped of my title and inheritance, and cast out from our community with nothing but the clothes on my back. There would be no middle ground, no compromise, no gradual transition that might preserve family relationships while allowing me to follow my conscience. Choose your family, or choose this foreign God. Those words echoed in my mind as I stood before the assembled relatives who had shaped my life since childhood. These were people I loved deeply, people who had invested in my education and future, people who genuinely believed they were trying to save my soul from eternal damnation. The pain of disappointing them was almost unbearable, but the thought of denying Jesus Christ after experiencing his love and power was even more impossible to contemplate. My father looked at me like I had died. The grief in his expression was not the anger of a man whose authority had been challenged, but the anguish of a parent watching his child destroy himself through incomprehensible choices. He had spent 28 years preparing me to be a leader in our community, a defender of Islamic values, a source of family pride and honor. Instead, he was witnessing what he perceived as my complete spiritual and social suicide. The cost of standing firm in my faith became clear with brutal efficiency. Within hours of my refusal to renounce Christianity, legal documents were prepared stripping me of access to family assets. removing my name from business partnerships, and formally disowning me from the royal lineage that had defined my identity since birth. Bank accounts were frozen, credit cards were cancelled, and even my personal belongings were declared forfeit as consequences of my spiritual treason. The loneliness and isolation that followed were crushing in their intensity. Friends who had been close companions for years suddenly refused to acknowledge my existence. Business associates canceled meetings and terminated professional relationships without explanation. Even servants in our household were instructed not to speak to me or provide any assistance that might be interpreted as support for my apostasy from Islam. But in the midst of losing everything I had previously valued, I discovered that my relationship with Jesus Christ was worth more than all the material wealth and social status I was sacrificing. The peace that surpassed understanding, which the Bible promised to believers, became my daily experience even as my circumstances grew increasingly difficult. The joy of knowing God personally sustained me through the darkest hours of rejection and abandonment by my earthly family. Living as an underground Christian in Saudi Arabia required constant vigilance and careful planning. Every aspect of my new life had to be conducted in secret, from attending worship services to studying scripture to maintaining fellowship with other believers. We met in different locations each week, communicated through coded messages, and developed elaborate systems to avoid detection by religious authorities who viewed Christian activity as a threat to public order. The other members of our secret Christian community became my new family, providing the love and support that had been withdrawn by my biological relatives. These brothers and sisters in Christ, many of whom had also sacrificed everything to follow Jesus, understood the unique challenges we faced as former Muslims living out our faith in a hostile environment. Their courage and commitment to Christ, despite ongoing persecution, became a source of daily inspiration for my own spiritual journey. God's miraculous protection continued to manifest in my life in ways that defied natural explanation. On multiple occasions, religious police conducting random investigations seemed to overlook evidence that should have led to my arrest. When neighbors reported suspicious activity at locations where we held secret worship services, the authorities would inexplicably focus their attention elsewhere. Divine intervention became as routine in my Christian life as persecution and hardship. Through sharing my testimony carefully with other seeking Muslims, I witnessed several remarkable conversions to Christianity. The story of how Jesus had protected the Bible, statue of Mary, and crucifix during the church fire resonated powerfully with people who had grown up believing that Allah would never permit Christian symbols to survive such challenges to Islamic supremacy. God was using my experience as an instrument to reach other souls trapped in the spiritual darkness I had once inhabited. Eventually, the dangers of remaining in Saudi Arabia became too great to ignore. With the help of international Christian organizations, I was able to seek asylum in a country where I could practice my faith openly without fear of imprisonment or death. The process of leaving my homeland was heartbreaking, but it opened the door to a ministry that has now reached thousands of people around the world with the testimony of God's miraculous power and love. Today, I live as an open follower of Jesus Christ, sharing my story at churches, conferences, and evangelical gatherings across multiple continents. The church fire that was supposed to be my gift to Allah became the foundation of a ministry that has led dozens of former Muslims to saving faith in Christ. Every time I tell this story, I am reminded of how God can transform even our worst intentions into instruments of His glory and grace. My relationship with my biological family remains complicated and painful. My sister has maintained secret contact with me over the years, expressing curiosity about the faith that was worth sacrificing everything to embrace. I continue to pray daily for the salvation of my father and other family members, believing that the same God who reached me in my hatred and rebellion can reach them in their religious certainty and cultural pride. What is God asking you to surrender to Him today? That is the question I pose to everyone who hears my testimony. The same Jesus who saved me from the flames of my own hatred wants to save you from whatever bondage or deception currently controls your life. The cost of following Him may seem overwhelming, but the reward of knowing Him personally and eternally is worth any sacrifice this world might demand. I came to destroy a church, but Jesus used that night to build His church in my heart. Every day I thank God for the fire that brought me to the light, and I pray that my story will kindle the same transformative fire in the hearts of others who are searching for truth, meaning, and genuine relationship with the living God who loves them beyond their ability to comprehend or deserve. The same Jesus who protected that Bible, statue of Mary, and wooden crucifix from my flames of hatred will protect and transform anyone who calls upon His name with sincere faith and genuine repentance.